Femi and Tobe walked the same streets and breathed the same air, but their similarities ended there. One lived by the clink of luxury car keys, the other, by the creak of a wooden wheelbarrow. Tobe and Amaka lived in a humble home filled with warmth. They had no car, but when Tobe pushed Amaka in his wheelbarrow, her joy was richer than any bank account. Femi and Kemi were the opposite. In their mansion, even the air was cold. When Femi gifted Kemi a pink sports car, she didn't smile, she reached for the keys with a dramatic, entitled sob. Their pockets were full, but their hearts were empty. Destiny was about to drag these two worlds together in a way no one saw coming. But before I reveal the terrifying thing Tobe found behind Femi's mansion gates, please like and subscribe. Also, let me know where you are watching from in the comments section. I want to know how far this story has traveled. To understand how a billionaire ended up at the mercy of a man with a wheelbarrow, we have to go back to the morning the secrets began to leak. Inside the towering glass walls of the Apex Plaza, Femi moved like a man who believed the earth spun solely on his command. His navy suit was crisp, the fabric catching the sterile office light as he strode past rows of workstations where employees kept their heads bowed, fearful of catching his eye. To Femi, these people were not colleagues, they were merely tools, cogs in a machine designed to keep his bank account overflowing. He slammed a folder onto his assistant's desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the quiet room. "If this report isn't perfected by noon," he barked, his voice smooth but laced with a lethal coldness, "don't bother coming back on Monday. I don't pay for mediocrity." He didn't wait for a response, his arrogance acting as a barrier that no plea for mercy could penetrate. While Femi ruled his corporate empire with an iron fist, Kemi spent her afternoon at the city's most exclusive boutique, her presence a storm of entitlement. She moved through the aisles, her heels clicking a rhythmic warning to the staff. When a young shop attendant, a girl with tired eyes and a neatly pinned name tag, approached to offer assistance, Kemi didn't even look at her. Instead, she held up a designer bag with 2 fingers, as if the very air around the commoner was tainted. "Do you actually expect me to believe this is the latest collection?" Kemi sneered, her voice loud enough to draw stares. "Or do you just save the quality for customers who don't look like they struggle to pay for their own bus fare?" The girl stammered an apology, but Kemi only rolled her eyes, her disdain for those she considered beneath her acting as her primary personality trait. For Kemi, life was a stage where she was the only star, and everyone else was merely background noise to be manipulated or mocked. Later that evening, as she sat in the back of her chauffeured car, she watched the street hawkers weaving through the humid traffic. She pulled up the window, sealing herself back into the climate-controlled silence of her own making. To her, the struggle of the city was a distant, ugly movie she had no intention of watching. She lived for the high-end saturation of her life, never realizing that the very commoners she despised held a wealth of spirit she couldn't even begin to comprehend. In the mansion that night, as she and Femi dined in a room large enough to house 10 families, the only thing louder than the clink of their silver cutlery was the hollow silence of 2 hearts that had long ago traded empathy for gold. In the soft, amber glow of the morning sun, Tobe's day did not begin with the chime of a digital alarm, but with the rhythmic sound of his own breathing as he prepared for another day of honest labor. His world was not one of glass towers or marble floors, but of red dust and the scent of frying akra that drifted through the narrow streets of their neighborhood. Tobe's hands were calloused, his palms etched with the history of every heavy load he had carried, yet those same hands were incredibly gentle as he adjusted the worn cushion in his old wooden wheelbarrow. He didn't see a rusted tool of poverty, he saw a vehicle of service. As Amaka stepped out of their modest home, her simple wrapper tied securely and her face bare of any expensive makeup, the smile she gave him was brighter than any diamond Femi could ever purchase. Their struggle was real, a constant dance with a limited budget and rising prices, but it was a dance they performed together with grace. While Kemi spent her mornings calculating her social status, Amaka spent hers calculating how to stretch a small bag of rice to feed their younger neighbors who had even less. "Tobe, remember to drink water today," she whispered, her voice a soothing melody against the harsh noise of the waking city. She didn't complain about the lack of a car or the dust that settled on her skin. Instead, she found beauty in the way the light hit the puddles after a rain and the warmth of Tobe's hand in hers. To them, wealth wasn't something stored in a bank, it was the peace they felt when they sat together on a wooden bench at the end of the day, sharing a single plate of food and 1,000 dreams. One afternoon, as Tobe pushed his wheelbarrow through the market, he spotted an elderly woman struggling with a massive crate of yams. Without a second thought and without asking for a single kobo, Tobe moved to her side. His back strained and his muscles burned, but the heart of gold that defined him wouldn't allow him to walk past someone in need. When he finally delivered the load, the woman offered him a small portion of her goods as thanks, but he politely declined with a humble tilt of his head. "Your prayers are enough, Mama," he said, his voice echoing the lessons of integrity he had lived by his entire life. This was the wealth that Femi and Kemi could never understand, a richness of spirit that made Tobe stand tall even in his worn trousers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dusty path home, Tobe didn't feel like a man defeated by life. He felt like a king returning to his queen, carrying a treasure of character that was worth more than all the gold in the world. The grand crystal ballroom was a shimmering cavern of excess, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the heavy, metallic tang of prestige. Femi stood near the center of the room, his navy suit sharp enough to cut through the crowd, as he clinked a crystal flute of imported champagne against the glasses of men who measured their worth in oil blocks and offshore accounts. Beside him, Kemi was a vision of golden arrogance in her fitted yellow dress, her laughter ringing out like a brittle chime whenever she caught her own reflection in the mirrored walls. To them, this was home, a place where the lighting was designed to hide flaws and the music was loud enough to drown out the conscience. Far from the center of the room, near the swinging double doors of the kitchen, Amaka adjusted the ties of her stiff white apron. Her feet ached in the simple black flats she had borrowed for the night, but her eyes remained clear and focused. She wasn't there to be seen, she was there to serve, her heart still full of the quiet prayer she and Tobe had shared before she left their dusty street. Tobe was outside, waiting near the service entrance in his worn trousers, ready to walk her home safely as soon as her shift ended. He was her anchor, but in this room of predators, she felt like a ghost moving through a world that didn't believe she existed. The collision was as sudden as a lightning strike. Kemi, gesturing wildly to emphasize a point about her new pink sports car, stepped backward just as Amaka approached with a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. The impact was slight, but the reaction was explosive. A single glass of red wine tipped, its contents splattering across the hem of Kemi's yellow dress. The music seemed to die in the air as Kemi spun around, her face contorting into a mask of pure fury. "Do you have any idea what this costs?" Kemi shrieked, her voice slicing through the polite hum of the ballroom. "You clumsy, insignificant girl. You've ruined something you couldn't afford if you worked for 100 years. Amaka dropped to her knees, not out of fear, but out of a reflexive desire to help, her hands reaching for a napkin to blot the stain. "I am so sorry, Ma," she whispered, her voice steady despite the humiliation. But Femi was already there, towering over her, his eyes cold and devoid of any humanity. He didn't see a woman, he saw an obstacle to his wife's comfort. "Don't touch her," Femi barked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibration. "Get out of our sight before I have the manager throw you and your pathetic life into the street." As Amaka looked up, she saw the rich pockets staring down at her with a disdain that chilled her to the bone. She stood up, her dignity the only thing she had left to carry, and walked toward the exit where Tobe was waiting, unaware that this moment of cruelty was the spark that would soon burn both their worlds to the ground. The sting of the ballroom encounter didn't end when the doors closed behind Amaka. Back in the sanctuary of her climate-controlled bedroom, Kemi paced the floor, her golden dress discarded like a piece of trash. The red wine stain was a small, dark blemish on the silk, but in her mind, it was a profound insult to her status. Her fury needed an outlet, and as she scrolled through her phone, she remembered the clear, high-definition video she had secretly recorded of the server's escort waiting at the service entrance. With a wicked glint in her eyes, she began to edit the footage. The video focused sharply on Tobe, standing under the dim yellow light of the alleyway. In the harsh zoom of her expensive lens, every flaw was magnified: the frayed hem of his trousers, the faded fabric stretched thin over his knees, and the humble way he shifted his weight in his worn sandals while waiting for his wife. Kemi didn't see a devoted husband, she saw a target. She added a mocking, upbeat soundtrack and plastered a caption across the screen in bold, neon letters: "When you try to enter the palace but your trousers belong in the museum. Face with tears of joy #luxury only #know your place." Within minutes of hitting post, the notification pings began to chime like a chorus of digital laughter. Kemi watched with satisfaction as the view count climbed. Her friends, women who traded in gossip and brand names, poured into the comments, adding their own insults to the fire. "Is that a trouser or a rag?" one wrote, followed by a string of laughing emojis. "Some people really have no shame appearing in public like this," another added. Kemi felt a rush of power, a cold thrill that came from using her rich pockets to crush the spirit of someone who had nothing. She wasn't just mocking a pair of pants, she was attempting to erase the dignity she had seen in Amaka's eyes. Unaware of the storm brewing online, Tobe and Amaka sat together in their small room, sharing a cup of tea by the light of a single bulb. Tobe noticed the quiet sadness in his wife's posture and reached out to cover her hand with his. "Don't let their words stay in your heart, Amaka," he whispered. "A dress can be stained, but a soul is only stained by how we treat others." He didn't know that at that very moment, his image was being shared across the city as a joke. Kemi sat in her dark room, illuminated only by the blue light of her screen, refreshed the page one more time to watch the numbers grow. She believed she had won, never realizing that her poor heart was being exposed to the world with every like she received. The viral mockery was intended to bury Tobe in shame, but it was instead setting the stage for a revelation that would leave Kemi with nothing but the digital echoes of her own cruelty. The sun was a merciless orb in the sky when the worlds of luxury and labor collided once again, this time on the very asphalt where Tobe earned his daily bread. Femi's sleek, pink sports car sat idling in the suffocating midday traffic, a bubble of cool air and soft leather amidst the chaos of the city. Inside, Femi gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the expensive grip. Suddenly, his breath hitched. A sharp, searing pain radiated through his chest, and the world began to tilt. The rich pockets that had always cushioned his life could not stop the biological rebellion happening within him. With a choked gasp, Femi collapsed against the door, his foot slipping off the brake as the car lurched to a halt. Kemi, sitting in the passenger seat and engrossed in the latest comments on her viral mockery video, didn't notice at first. When she finally looked up and saw Femi's gray face and the foam flecking his lips, her first instinct wasn't love, but a cold, paralyzing fear of the ugly. Femi groaned, his hand reaching out to her, clawing at the air for support. He needed to be pulled upright, he needed the door opened, he needed the touch of someone who cared. But Kemi looked down at her fitted yellow dress, the silk shimmering under the sun, and then at the sweat and bile beginning to stain Femi's navy suit. She recoiled, pressing her back against the passenger door. "Femi, get up. You're making a scene," she hissed, her voice trembling not with grief, but with embarrassment. People began to gather around the car, their faces pressed against the tinted glass. Kemi looked at her husband's desperate eyes and then at her pristine sleeves. She couldn't bring herself to touch him. She couldn't risk the mess of a dying man ruining her carefully curated image. She stayed frozen, her heart as empty as the luxury she worshipped, while Femi's hand finally dropped, hitting the floor mat with a hollow thud. Outside the car, the crowd grew louder, but no one knew how to open the high-tech locks of the luxury vehicle. It was a prison of gold. Kemi sat inside, dry-eyed and panicked, more worried about the dirt on the upholstery than the life slipping away beside her. Just then, the rhythmic, metallic creak of a wooden wheelbarrow pierced through the shouting. Tobe was pushing through the throng, his brow slick with sweat, his worn trousers dusty from the road. He didn't know whose car it was, and he didn't care about the brand. He only saw a human being in a cage of glass, gasping for his last breath. While the woman in the yellow dress sat inside, protecting her fabric, the man in the rags was already looking for a stone to shatter the glass and bring the mercy that money had failed to provide. The sound of the stone meeting the reinforced glass was a sharp, desperate crack that echoed through the panicked silence of the street. While Kemi sat huddled in the corner of the passenger seat, shielding her eyes and her expensive fabric from the flying shards, Tobe didn't flinch. He reached through the jagged opening, his rough, calloused hands, the ones Kemi had mocked just hours before on social media, working with urgent precision to unlock the door from the inside. When the door finally swung open, the cool, artificial air of the luxury car escaped, replaced by the honest heat of the Lagos sun and the smell of the earth. Femi's body was heavy, a dead weight of fine navy wool and failing breath. Tobe didn't hesitate. He hooked his arms under Femi's shoulders, his muscles straining as he pulled the billionaire out of the prison of gold and onto the dusty pavement. Amaka was already there, kneeling in the dirt without a single thought for her simple wrapper. She didn't have a medical degree, but she had a heart that had been trained in the school of survival. She quickly loosened Femi's silk tie, unbuttoning his collar to give his lungs space to fight. "The traffic is too heavy. No ambulance can reach here," a voice shouted from the crowd. Kemi stepped out of the car then, looking at the scene with a mixture of horror and disgust. She saw her husband lying in the dust, his head cradled by a woman she had called insignificant, his life being fought for by a man she had labeled a museum piece. "Don't just stand there," Kemi wailed, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. "Do something. Someone call a private hospital." Tobe looked at the gridlock of cars stretching for miles and then at the wooden wheelbarrow standing nearby. It was a humble tool, built for yams and cement bags, but in this moment of life and death, it was the only vehicle that could move. "Amaka, help me," Tobe commanded. Together, they lifted the man who had once threatened to throw them into the street and placed him onto the worn cushion of the wheelbarrow. It was a sight the city would never forget, a billionaire in a $5,000 suit being raced through the narrow alleys and side streets by a man in frayed trousers. Tobe ran until his lungs burned and his sandals snapped, pushing the wheelbarrow with a strength fueled by pure integrity. Amaka ran beside them, keeping Femi's head steady and whispering words of life into the silence of his unconsciousness. They used their poor resources, their strength, their speed, and their unwavering compassion, to provide the mercy that all of Femi's billions couldn't buy. Behind them, Kemi was left standing in the middle of the road, her yellow dress pristine but her soul utterly abandoned, watching as the man she despised carried her entire world away on a piece of wood. The sirens did not wail with the urgency of an ambulance seeking to save a life, instead, they moaned with the heavy, inevitable weight of a reckoning. As Femi lay in a sterile hospital bed, his breath hitched to a ventilator and his heart struggling to find its rhythm, the world he had built on a foundation of greed began to dissolve. Outside the hospital's high-security wing, a fleet of black sedans and police vans pulled up to the gates of his mansion. The rich pockets that had once held the keys to the city were about to be turned inside out. Kemi stood in the grand foyer, her yellow dress now rumpled and stained with the gray dust of the street. She clutched a designer bag to her chest as if it were a shield, watching in paralyzed silence as officers in dark uniforms swarmed the marble halls. They didn't move with the deference she was used to, they moved with the cold authority of the law. "Ma'am, step aside," one officer commanded, his voice as sharp as the handcuffs hanging from his belt. "This property and all assets within are being seized under a state warrant for systemic corruption and money laundering." The sound of the first seal being placed on the heavy mahogany doors was like a final heartbeat. Kemi watched as the pink sports car, the very one she had used to mock the museum piece, trousers of Tobe, was loaded onto a flatbed tow truck. The jewelry boxes, the stacks of foreign currency, and the high-end electronics were all hauled away in plastic bins, categorized as evidence rather than status symbols. The arrogance that had once made her feel untouchable evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She was a queen without a throne, standing in a house that no longer belonged to her, surrounded by men who saw her not as a socialite, but as an accomplice. As the officers led her toward the exit, a crowd of neighbors and passers-by gathered at the gates. Among them, she spotted a few of the very people she had looked down upon from her tinted windows. They weren't cheering, but their eyes held a somber reflection of the truth she had ignored, that wealth acquired through the pain of others is merely a temporary loan. The metal gates, once meant to keep the commoners out, were now locked from the outside by the state. Kemi was escorted to a waiting van, her hands trembling as she realized that the luxury which had defined her soul had vanished in a single afternoon. Her pockets were officially empty, leaving nothing behind but the cold, heavy reality of a heart that had never learned how to be rich in anything else. The sterile white walls of the hospital corridor felt like a purgatory, a space where the noise of the world faded into a haunting silence. Femi lay stable but weak, his eyes flickering open to see the two people he had once deemed unworthy of his shadow. Tobe and Amaka sat on the hard plastic chairs nearby, their presence a quiet testament to a mercy he couldn't comprehend. Kemi was absent, caught in the web of legal battles, but a new visitor had arrived, Tobe's mother, Mama Ngozi. She stood at the foot of Femi's bed, her eyes clouded with a secret that had been ripening for nearly 4 decades. As Femi's gaze met the elderly woman's, a look of haunting recognition crossed his face. He saw in her the same eyes that looked back at him from his own childhood photos, eyes that belonged to the woman his father had discarded like a piece of broken furniture. Mama Ngozi stepped forward, her voice a trembling whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "Femi," she began, her hand reaching out but stopping just short of the expensive bedsheets. "The man who raised you, the one you call father, he was once the man I called my husband." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Tobe stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mama, what are you saying?" She turned to her son, the man in the worn trousers, and then back to the man in the hospital gown. "Before the mansions and the corruption, your father was a different man. But when the wealth started to come, he decided I wasn't polished enough for his new life. He drove me out when I was pregnant with you, Tobe. He married a woman of high status, Femi's mother, and erased us from his history." She pulled a tattered, yellowed photograph from her wrapper, a picture of a young man standing between 2 women, a split in the paper separating them. "You aren't just strangers," she sobbed, the revelation finally breaking free. "You are blood. You are brothers, born of the same father, separated only by a man's pride and the size of his pockets." The silence that followed was deafening. Tobe looked at Femi, not as a wealthy enemy, but as a fractured reflection of himself. The DNA results, which Mama Ngozi had quietly pursued through a charitable legal aid clinic weeks prior, were gripped in her shaking hand, the final, scientific proof of their shared heritage. Femi closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the medicine-scented air. The rich pockets had been a lie, a gilded cage built on the abandonment of his own flesh and blood. In that small hospital room, the labels of rich and poor dissolved, leaving behind nothing but 2 brothers and the wreckage of a father's cruelty. The transition from the sterile hospital room to the dusty, vibrant streets of the neighborhood was the final journey of Femi's transformation. Having lost the glass towers and the fleet of cars, he found himself standing before Tobe's humble workshop, his hands no longer clutching designer briefcases but reaching for the rough handle of a shared burden. The state had taken his assets, and his father's sins had taken his identity, but in the quiet, steady gaze of the brother he had once mocked, Femi found the only thing he had never been able to buy, a fresh start. Tobe didn't welcome him with a lecture or a reminder of his past cruelty. Instead, he simply handed Femi a pair of work gloves and pointed to the wooden wheelbarrow, the very one that had saved Femi's life. "A man is not measured by what he sits on, but by what he carries for others," Tobe said softly. As the sun beat down on their backs, the 2 brothers worked side by side. Femi's hands, once soft and manicured, began to develop the same honest calluses that etched Tobe's palms. He learned the rhythm of the neighborhood, the value of a greeting, and the profound satisfaction of a day's work that benefited a neighbor rather than a secret bank account. Kemi, too, had changed. Stripped of the yellow dresses that acted as her armor, she began to help Amaka in the community kitchen. The woman who once refused to mess up her dress was now the first to roll up her sleeves to stir a massive pot of jollof rice for the local orphans. One evening, as the four of them sat together on wooden benches outside the workshop, the clink of simple tin cups replaced the sound of crystal champagne flutes. The laughter that echoed through the air wasn't brittle or forced, it was the sound of hearts that had finally been filled. Femi looked at Tobe, then at the simple life they were building from the wreckage of their father's pride. He realized then that his rich pockets had been a heavy weight, keeping him from the very peace he now felt in his poor surroundings. He had discovered the great reversal of life, that wealth is a shadow that can vanish with the wind, but character is the only inheritance that never fades. As the moon rose over the dusty street, Femi didn't miss the mansion. For the first time in his life, his heart was as full as his pockets were empty, and he was finally, truly, rich. Thank you for watching. Let me know your own thoughts about the story in the comments section.